All right, hello, I'm Nick Montfort, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks to Babycastles, to be here with the Babycastles community to launch the second edition of Exploratory Programming for the Arts and Humanities. Hard to imagine anything more exciting than a book launch for a second edition textbook, but it's a project that's very dear to me. And we'll talk about why that is, why the overall project is so important, why the open access formats that have come out are so significant from my standpoint. And to start off with, I want to introduce and thank Nikita Braguinski, who's joining us from Berlin. And we've been in conversation for a few years now at this point. He's visited Babycastles before, and he's a fan of the space in New York and hoping to get there again, as we all are. So he's joining us from Berlin right now. How's the weather? What are things like in Berlin, Nikita?
Well, it's pretty warm here. I think it was around. Well, we have different systems anyway, so numbers don't really convey the meaning of the weather here.
It's pretty hot and humid right now in New York, as it happens. Mm-hmm. And there are celebratory festivals. Pride Fest is going on. People are enduring the heat for that celebration. I want to thank also Babycastles and Lee Tussman, who has, in addition to running the Babycastles Academy programs, who has stepped up to host this and allow us to have this conversation so that all of the difficult challenges of putting this on, he's actually dealing with. He's the man behind the curtain. Not literally. There's actually nothing behind the curtain. But he's figuratively the man behind the curtain. So thank you very much, Lee. And then thanks to everybody who's here, and thanks to all of you future people who are watching on YouTube. So let's go ahead and get started and see. Yeah. We'll find out what questions there are from the audience at some point. But first of all, I think Nikita and I have some conversation to undertake.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So I wanted to start with one thing I was wondering about, and namely, you are a poet in New York City.
Yes, I have the misfortune to be a poet and the fortune to be in New York City. That's right.
And you are a professor in Massachusetts at MIT. And each of these activities is, I think, extremely time-consuming. Each of them is a full-time job. So why did you choose to write this book, in addition to all the other things that you do?
So it was a very conscious decision. I really thought about the project of doing this. It wasn't an offhand idea to write a textbook. It wasn't something people were asking me to do. And it certainly wasn't something I was doing to enrich myself financially. Even if we go back to the first edition, these are $40 textbooks. And unlike some of the $200 textbooks in standard subjects in chemistry or biology or computer architecture or things like that. Some of the more lucrative textbooks, sort of fit into an existing course. They're these standard college undergraduate courses that you have to teach. So my project is very different. I wasn't trying to get into the market. I was really trying to introduce some new ideas about what programming could be and open up the possibilities of programming for people who had, throughout their undergraduate studies for the most part, people who maybe were in graduate school, they hadn't learned to program, but they knew a lot about the humanities and arts. So part of it is a teaching mission to reach those sorts of students to enable that type of work. It's also really, I see it as something that is an intervention in what has been called the digital humanities. No one exactly knows what the digital humanities is, but we know it has something to do with new applications of computer techniques, new development of methods, hopefully going beyond that, hopefully the creation of an interdiscipline that brings computing and the humanities together. Not just taking what the computer can do and using humanities as a domain, but developing something richer like computational biology or computational linguistics. Well, I really hope for this endeavor to succeed. I'm really wanting there to be a digital humanities, or as I would call it, a computational humanities, to carry that analogy forward. And so there are a few different possibilities as far as how that can happen. And one of the ways is to do projects, to do DH projects or do computational humanities projects. You put them up on a website, you publish about them, you let people see what you've accomplished. Some people have done that to very, very good effect. So I don't want to start naming names, but there have been some great DH projects, and then there have been a raft of other DH projects that are good for the specialists in the field. They advance understanding of particular topics. All of these things together, trying to build this new area, this new interdiscipline. But my thought was that if I spent my effort doing that, maybe I could build, 5 or 10 projects over the span of a few years. So why not spend that time writing a textbook that could enable hundreds or thousands of students to undertake projects themselves? So my interest is not so much in a few sort of showcase pieces that I would work on, I would get credit for, but actually a broad base of work in the humanities and arts. And also, I have my own ideas about how it is this type of programming education should be undertaken, how that people should explore, that they should combine humanistic and artistic ideas. And the project isn't only for grad students at universities. It's for many sorts of independent learners. And I've been helped by independent learners, for instance, in the Society of Spoken Art, some of whom are here today. So I'm very grateful for the different ways that people have interacted with and learned from and reflected on the book. So that's a little of why this textbook project in particular.
Yeah. So you have been stressing the digital humanities projects side of this, stressing the way people can learn to experiment with this kind of work. From reading the book, I believe the scope is even broader. Your idea there, as you put it, seems to be to try to enable people to think in a different way, in a new way, to think using a new tool. Like there is a well-known idea that writing has transformed the way humans think, and that we could never be able to think like we do without the tool of writing and reading. So this seems to be a little bit in the background of what you are trying to do, to try to teach people a new, for them, new kind of literacy, to enable them to experiment with a new way of thinking. Is that what you're trying to do?
Exactly. And in fact, when I mention the humanities and projects and sort of the DH thread of things, and how the textbook, for me, it comes about by not doing DH projects and instead writing this textbook, which I hope will enable a lot of work along those lines, right? I should also mention that, the book isn't just about doing DH projects. It's not, introduction to programming for the digital humanities, right? The way I see it, the arts component is also very important. However, I can't claim to have put aside my practice as a computational poet, as someone working in the computational arts, to write this textbook. So that is something that I have continued. And I see working as an artist and thinking as an artist, as one programs, right? This type of creative computing, it's often called, mindset, right? As one of the important ones that an exploratory programmer can have. And then there's also, in the most powerful ideas behind the digital humanities or the computational humanities, right? There's the idea that you can use programming as inquiry. That, in other words, you haven't just gotten some materials together and, for instance, put up a website about them. You haven't just made a publication. Not to say that publications are unimportant, right? But they don't transform thought in the way that the new methodologies of programming as inquiry can, right? So if we look at what goes on in the digital humanities, there is this programming as inquiry type of framework or mindset. From my standpoint, these are not two different types of activities. They're just different sorts of emphases or maybe stances within the same overall activity. That's why it's exploratory programming for the arts and humanities. That's why I want people to learn not just about creative coding and not just about how you analytically or humanistically would approach things with programming, but how you put them together. And indeed, I believe programming is a very, very essential. So first of all, we want to think about programming sounds like it has this reputation as a very sort of instrumental and low-level activity. It's what you learn in order to become a software developer, right? Programming, as I see it, is just the most general way in which to use computation. If you want to try to bring computation into the creative, humanistic, intellectual world in a powerful new way, you need to be able to use it very generally. You need to be able to do whatever can be done, not just rely on those apps that happen to be out there.
Right.
And so that's, to me, what programming is about in this context. It's being the most general type of user of computation and the most general type of thinker with computation, someone who's able to engage with computing as a means of inquiry and as a means of creativity.
Yes, absolutely. When I read the book and I looked at the examples and the overall setup of this all, I was struck by the contrast between this approach to programming and the way a programmer typically works professionally. This is such a huge contrast. If you think of a professional programmer, what does this person do? And almost everything is completely, really the opposite.
So potentially so. I do want to note that, so first of all, there's a distinction. You possibly are talking about software developers. And so in software development, right, people are working together. They have to coordinate. They, have indicated objectives and so forth. Even then, software development doesn't have the same type of waterfall model, monolithic type of concept, these, agile approaches and these different sorts of exploratory ideas that you may see in entrepreneurial practice.
That's right.
They do exist, okay. But in fact, when people are getting their programming education, for instance, as computer scientists, right, the model of not an exploratory programmer, but that instrumental software developer, right, that's what we start off with. Usually we try to say, how can you accomplish this? How can you learn the skills that are needed, toward that end? Now, there is another, even then, there's another type of programmer, which is a data scientist, right? And a data scientist actually doesn't ship, or deliver software systems, but the data scientist is supposed to provide insights, basically, right? So the data scientist is, in fact, using programming to inquire and to learn about what goes on. So there are models in industry. I don't want to suggest that what I'm proposing or the stance that I'm taking is actually too far away from certain other types of programming education and programming practice.
Yeah. I agree. So what if we turn to the poetic practice once again? I'm interested in it, in the connections here. I know that you are interested in programming old computers. You
Yes.
own some old computers and you do write programs for them. And in reading this, I was also wondering, is there a connection? Can I see a connection there? Are you trying to enable people to start to think in similar ways, or try to enable people to have more fun with what is like programming an old computer, as opposed to using a new one?
So I think there's a few connections, but let me stick to one so that I can be clear, at least about one that I do see. For me, in my practice, I'm not so much interested in nostalgia, either restorative or reflective. I am interested in looking at good design qualities from decades past, that have been overlooked. I'm interested in taking seriously the way that people built computer platforms and how they thought about what a computer should be. What does it mean to provide a computer that's going out to, obviously it didn't reach everyone in society, but it reached way beyond the hermetic server rooms of universities, or, mainframe and mini computer rooms of universities at the time. It provided much more access to computing. In the late 1970s and 1980s, millions of people learned how to program computers just for fun of it and to understand computation. not to do Google Summer of Code or get a job at Microsoft or improve, get a certification or something like this, but just because they wanted to see what computing could do. Computing was made available via the basic programming language, its many dialects. It was exposed in books and magazines. People would type in programs, people would get access to this, and a welcoming situation for computing and programming was established. Things were not hidden from view. It wasn't projected that you were unable to deal with this unless you were an expert, or unless you had a degree, or unless you had a job. And so I think there was a lot positive that was going on at that time. Even the very term creative computing, which is one I embraced in the book, comes from a magazine of that era, the title of a magazine. I do think there were substantial things about how sort of home computing and access to computing and the way that people were welcomed to try out programming and learn things about computing, how all of that happened in the late 1970s and 1980s, that we should still look to as a positive example. That's only one of the things that draws me in my creative practice to use these older classic computers. But that is one thing, and that's a connection between what's going on in exploratory programming and what happens when I program the Apple II or Commodore 64.
Yes. Which question should I choose? So maybe this one. There is a way people use mathematics for recreational purposes. This is called recreational mathematics. Some people are afraid of mathematics and they could never think of using mathematics recreationally. Mathematics is something that is done at school, and then you get your grade and that's it. And some people like it so much that they actually use it for recreational purposes.
Yes.
So would you say that this is recreational programming?
Certainly. In fact, that's a good name for what happens in the early 1980s, around that time period I was talking about, right? Because it wasn't sort of, there are books that are things like, 101 computer games, but when you actually look at what was in them, they're not things we would call games today. There were poetry generators, or like a basic version of the chatterbot Eliza, things like that. So indeed, they were recreational programs then. And there's aspects of recreational programming. And yeah, I mean, there are people who are into, sort of like aspects of, maybe people who love their cars, who are into, recreational mechanical engineering, right? People who are into recreational mathematics. And of course, people who garden, and so people have all these different sorts of engagements. One thing I should mention is that I do think that programming is very important and it's accessible to everyone. So even though there are some people who are math phobic, the thing about programming is and computing is that you don't have to do math. The computer does the math for you. And the things that you need to do are more along the lines of providing recipes. Now they have to be very, very formal recipes, but sort of, making recipes of the sort that you do for cooking, right, is more an activity than doing arithmetic when it comes to programming. So I do think these methods are going to be important broadly, and I think they're going to be accessible to people, even people who consider themselves to be, math phobic. Now, that said, I mean, people always choose their directions in terms of what they like to study. So I like to study, the history of material text. I like to reverse engineer programs. I like to, if I want to know about the Atari 2600, the Atari VCS, I would look at a cartridge, right? And I would want to look at its material properties. I would want to reverse engineer the game on it. I would want to try to understand things that way. But obviously that's not the only good way to learn about a system like this. You should also, or people, scholars in general, in the world, we should have people who are willing to talk with the people who program this game and who are at the company. People should be willing to do interviews. We should have anthropologists, ethnographers, right? So that's the thing. All these methods come together to provide a better understanding of the topics that we're interested in. So I'm actually, even though I'm very exuberant at talking about programming, and we're having this nice conversation here, I don't like to go, be a participant observer and interview people. That's not my thing. I'd rather work with the materials, take a sort of bibliographic perspective, so forth, right? So we all have our different tendencies, but I don't think programming is something that anyone should rule out. I think that it is, as you put it, it's more along the lines of a basic type of method like writing, a literacy for future types of thinking that can help us to incorporate all of these other means of inquiry.
Maybe last one from me. For now, I can't see anything beyond Zoom right now, so I don't know if there...
We don't have questions yet, but we can see if there are some.
Okay, all right. So maybe this question here. We all have been learning to read and write and to analyze literary texts, to understand them for a very long time, for many years. We went through school and so on, and have been reading, and children's books have been read to us, all of that.
Yes, that's true. Even if you don't make it to the 17th grade, right? Even if you don't do graduate school, I mean, anyone who goes through, when you go through grade school, any education you have, right, is about, exactly interpreting texts. When you have story time at the library, when you have stories before bedtime, this is deep in our culture. Yes.
Yes. So almost everyone is very much familiar with that. So we are all very good at that. But I was wondering, how much time does one really need to become as flexible in programming? We don't need to all be very professional programming, but how much time does it take before it stops being painful? What do you think?
Well, I think the challenge, I think where the pain, the source of this pain of which you speak, right, is that people have an idea of, so first of all, programming is very fast moving. Things are changing. There's new, not just new programming languages, but entire new sorts of paradigms. You know, it's very hard to keep up with these sorts of practices in ways that we don't find with reading, except to the extent that, you know, reading also is engaged with the digital and with computing. And so that's part of the challenge. And I think it's hard to decide on what's really essential and what's really fundamental about programming. In my view, it's not a lot. You can do a great deal with a few of the fundamentals. You don't need a minor in computer science at the undergraduate level, for instance, right? Really a series of courses. You need to approach things seriously and then have the willingness to explore. You know, I think of it as, I guess you want to identify what your goals are going to be. Some of the analogies that I make, you know, in terms of, one of the things that's different about learning to program as opposed to, let's say, you know, getting through your first chemistry class, you know, as an undergraduate, is that programming is a practice that you need to learn how to undertake. And in that way, it's more like learning a sport or learning to play a musical instrument or learning a language. I don't mean to overstate. I'm not saying that programming languages are like human languages. That's not true, actually, because programming languages aren't capable of general expression. And human languages aren't very good at making the formal sort of recipes that you need with programming. But the reason they're similar is you have to practice in order to make progress. It's not just a matter of reading a book. And so in the book, I give 4 methods for success, one of which is reading the book, also typing in all the code and seeing it work. Also doing the exercises, which are basically just what we call problem sets at MIT. They're things that have answers. And then finally doing what I call free projects, which are assignments, but you're told as a learner to figure out what it is you're going to do, to chart your own course within certain specified boundaries, right? So these things then allow you to work ahead, and you know, you need to figure out what your goals are and understand, you know, for instance, why are you learning this language? Are you going to are you learning this language because that's going to be your career? You're going to be an anthropologist, and you want to you know, do a PhD in this area of studies, and you know, join a university faculty, and you know, or is it because you're in the Foreign Service and you know, you need to be very highly fluent, right? So those would be some goals. Is it because you want to take a trip and be able to get around in the country and deal with day-to-day sorts of issues? Is there something in between, right? And again, what's your goal as far as wanting to play the sport? Do you want to play the sport professionally? Or, you know, do you want to be able to be engaged with it and get joy out of it? You know, with people in the neighborhood, is it something that you want? Is it something you want to do throughout your life? Is it something that you only care about for a short phase? You know, all of these are questions that you need to bring to the practice that you're trying to undertake as a programmer. So people, will put in more or less effort, and you can accomplish, the ability to explore with programming with a reasonable grasp of the fundamentals, not years of work, not years of study. Or you can turn to doing that more intensively.
Mm.
There is a question, actually. There's 2 questions that are in the chat. I just want to mention one thing, Nikita, if it's okay, before we turn to that. I wanted to say something about what's new in the 2nd edition, because I don't think we actually chatted about that so far.
Right.
Some of it is just, like I added illustrations. I reorganized the book, having learned some from, teaching with the 1st edition. There's some new material. There's a small amount of material actually taken out because I thought it was just more confusing than helpful. There's no reason to deal with this piece. There's an update from Python 2 to 3, but that really wasn't, it was necessary, but that wasn't the occasion for the new edition. A large number of new exercises were added because I really hoped to get away without having these exercises. I thought, let's do the projects instead. The projects are more part of my educational philosophy. They're more fun. But it turns out, in order to really establish this basis of essentials and fundamentals up through chapter 6, you really need those projects. Not those projects, but those exercises. But the big change is the ability to get to the digital open access editions, which the MIT libraries made available. So it was their support that allowed us to do that. And I do think that, so I personally find that, and the best way to learn from the book is to have a hardback copy of the book. You get a library, you don't have to buy it. And I'm not trying to sell you one, but if you were to open it up, set it next to your computer, and type things in from this book and be able to quickly reference different parts of it, just like you would from a book or magazine in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I think that's actually the best learning situation. There are several digital formats that are available. If you do use those, I would remove as much temptation as possible for you to copy and paste, because this whole idea of copying and pasting code, you rapidly run into a wall for your understanding of fundamentals and your ability to be a good exploratory programmer. So what I would do is I would just actually, you could take the EPUB version, for instance, and put it on your phone and put that next to your computer. Not as good as a book, but still. So that would be my recommendation about how to actually make use of the digital formats. So here's, so Nikita, I don't know if you can see the questions on Twitch.
I can't.
Okay, I can see them. So I'm glad to read them and offer some answers. So Ludolog asks, can you imagine an oral basis for programming and or computation? So, wow, this is a very, very profound question. I've actually been very interested in questions of how oral societies, primary oral cultures, differ from our current society, which is not just based on writing, but based on print, and in many ways post-print, based on electronic textuality. Looking at things like Walter Ong's book, Orality and Literacy, and what's followed that. I think that programming and computation, so one of the things, the easy answer is to say no, that orality is too remote and the methods of thinking are too remote. The more correct answer probably is that you don't ever have a society that is truly based entirely on writing, and in which, everything from the primary oral culture is gone, right? There's plenty of examples of this. It's how you see, for instance, amazing freestyle rappers who actually carry around, dictionaries to read them, right? This infusion and cross reference of this highly print, written artifact with this, amazing practice of orality. And you also see it to give an academic example, it's like in the dissertation process, right? So one thing you have to do is you have to write this big written document, and that's a requirement to do your PhD. And the whole writing part of it is, your margins have to be checked out and everything else. But you also then have to defend it. You have to do an oral, performance process related to that, right? And so this is an example on Gibbs of how, it's not good enough to do just the written culture thing. You also have to do the oral culture thing. I don't know exactly how it is that oral culture persists in programming and computation in those ways. The one way I can think of it is that with some colleagues, I did a book that is called 10 Print Char String 205.5 plus Rand 1 Go to 10. It's a one-line program for the Commodore 64. And this is a written program, no doubt. And the program even though I'm able to recite it orally, it started off in writing, obviously. But it's interesting that when we first started discussing and thinking about this program, we actually didn't have a written source for it. It was just something I remembered. And so that type of mnemonic, oral type of persistence, it does occur in computing culture. People remember, or sometimes misremember or modify whatever it is, a Perl one-liner, something like that. So I'm not sure whether we get an oral basis for programming, but we don't get rid of the orality when we move to programming and computation. Fresh Dope Games has a question. How do you imagine disadvantaged communities around the world can program in a humanitarian way that can help lift those communities? Okay, this I think is a very important question, and it really gets to why I have a very strong interest in open access. By the way, this book is also open access. It's also a Creative Commons book available for free download. And, I've had extensive conversations with MIT Press, with people there. MIT Press is a nonprofit organization. It has a mission. It wants to get knowledge out to help people learn. And MIT Press is very proud of having, really, really good distribution, being able to get books to lots of places, being able to get books into libraries, lots of places as well. But it just cannot reach everywhere. It cannot reach to small universities in Eastern Europe, much less, places in Africa or South Asia. And so making the textbook available open access and allowing people to learn from it and get to it the way they can is, again, as I was saying earlier, sort of my way of saying, like, I don't know the specific ways in which people are going to program in humanitarian and uplifting ways. right? Because you have to figure that out within your own cultural context, right? And in fact, the book, the book comes from a United States context. So it doesn't speak to everybody in Africa and South Asia and Eastern Europe. It refers to Gerald Manley Hopkins and Jorge Luis Borges and DMX, RIP, and Jamaica Kincaid, and people who, the sort of literary figures that we know about in the US and in the West. It may not be the right book for everyone in the world, because I do, believe that computing is culturally situated, and you need to sort of figure out what it means in your own situation. But the best I can do to start off is at least to let my idea of how to learn about computing be as accessible as possible. In a lot of ways, probably what would be needed to really have humanitarian programming and uplifting programming throughout the world in different communities would be not just translations, but localizations of the whole exploratory programming idea. And people should take it and make their own concept out of it. They don't have to imitate or derive from me. So there's one more I see right now, and it's from Casey Boyle, who I know has been teaching the book. And he says, when I tell my colleagues in computer science or engineering about how the book orients a beginning programming student, those colleagues are kind of perplexed because of its iterative and recursive structure, as opposed to their block A, block B, block C approach. Have you experienced this kind of reaction by more traditional programming teachers? So what this refers to is the book actually does a lot of things where, I've read other programming textbooks that tell you straight out, they say like, don't do this. Don't tell people how to solve the same problem two different ways. Because that confuses them. And so I explain how to solve the same problem three different ways, actually, because the point of the book is not, like in this case, the problem is a palindrome checker, right? Well, why are you writing a palindrome checker? Is it so you can get it, approved by the Apple Store and make some money checking palindromes? That doesn't make any sense. The only reason you're making a palindrome checker is so that you learn about programming, so you educate yourself, right? So why don't you use that activity as a way to understand these different approaches, right? There is one approach which is reversing, there's one which is iteration, there's one which is recursion. And it turns out that the type of thing that you need to do is say, is this string a palindrome? I'm sort of giving away something that people should discover for themselves in the book. But it turns out, right, that if you want to know whether an image is symmetric, it's basically the same thing. It's basically the same operation, right? So you learn how to do something in one medium, in the medium of text, and then that applies across to a different medium of image, right? And so that's some of what we're doing. And another point is that the reason I do this is some people care less about certain media and more about others, right? So some people are really into what can be done with text, which I am, personally. I'm more of a text guy myself. Some people are more interested in image, and those are the two main media that are engaged.
Or music.
There is some sound, yes, it's a very unusual approach to sound. But it's and even that's also a way to allow people to see how some of the weird bitwise operations actually literally play out as waveforms and sound. But so that's the long answer, Casey. The short answer is yes. People are sometimes a little perplexed by the way, you know, the programming discussion sort of loops on itself and recurs throughout the book in different places. I think it is a way of showing people that it's sensible to explore, that there are connections to be made, which you might not realize at first. I hope it's in some ways this is all an artificial type of setup when you have a textbook that's leading people through different activities and different experiences. But I hope it's a little bit more authentic than one might otherwise encounter to have those types of experiences and recurrences. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I think we have all the questions that were put in there answered. I want to thank again my fellows in SOSA. Thank you, ITs. People who showed up today, some of whom asked some questions that were very good, and people who supported me by working with the book. It is a book that engages with verbal art, with different aspects of analytics on images, with one curious venture into sound and music, as Nikita mentions. And so really my hope for it is, and particularly my hope for the second edition is, it's a book that I feel like to really succeed with it, it makes sense to have it as, if you're an individual, it makes sense to take it and go through it very seriously, to pursue everything that's in the book. If you're a teacher, it makes sense to make it the central text in your course. And that means, having an exploratory programming course, not taking an existing course very often and dropping this in. I know that people were reticent to do that after the first edition came out. And first of all, the second edition is better, I hope. I've improved it. I made the learning situation better for people. But also, because of the open access to it, you can peek in and see what you like. And if you want to use a piece of it and try it out, even though that doesn't fit with my holistic idea of putting the, programming for the humanities, programming for the arts together, of going across media, of going across programming languages, it's fine. Take a piece and see how that works for you. See how people are interested in that project. And thanks a lot for coming. And I will mention something that has been put into the chat, but I want to give voice to it as well. So Babycastles is an IRL space which has been closed for the last year and a half, unfortunately. We're very much looking forward to getting back there. It's a community DIY art collective, art space. It's on 14th Street. I would ask those who can afford it to make a donation to Babycastles. The link is in the chat. And then some of the other stuff that goes on, Babycastles Academy has other opportunities where people teach about specific tools and skills. Word Hack is a monthly event that focuses on language and its different relationships to computing. I'm not going to name all of them right now, but those are the two that come to mind. We're very much looking forward. I'm very much looking forward to making it back to Babycastles in person when the public health situation allows. Thanks to all of you, and especially Lee for keeping everything together, and Nikita, thanks very much for having that conversation with me.
Thank you.